You may have noticed that in recent years and in recent weeks, apocalypse has become kind of a loose term. It's probably not surprising that it's a go-to for the crisis that we find ourselves in. We've been using the language and the imagery of apocalypse for quite some time, not just for the endless stream of movies, TV shows, books that play out some version of the end of the world as we know it, but also in the way that we report and consume news. I've been collecting examples of this for a while, and it's not just the largest scale crises like climate change that get couched in these terms. Whether it's university funding or big data or our politics or our diets, it seems we can put an apocalyptic slant on pretty much any bad news story, which is to say pretty much any news story. Tinder is the dating apocalypse. Have smartphones destroyed a generation? What you need to know about the coming jellyfish apocalypse. If this is almost our default method for having a conversation about cultural and ecological trends, then it makes sense that it's also how we're talking about COVID-19. After all, we have seen a lot of classic apocalyptic tropes come to life. Deserted streets, grounded planes, panic buying, emergency powers. We have these templates, these stories to set over our current experience and weigh it against. And in lots of ways, actually, those pictures are not matching up all that well. Sure, there are Walking Dead type elements to what we've been experiencing. But if we're honest, and also, of course, if we're lucky, a lot of this is very mundane as apocalypses go. I have very much enjoyed the way certain memes nailed this everyday dimension to the crisis. You know, being asked to really step up and watch more Netflix, everything being cancelled, but laundry is never cancelled. All of us suddenly experiencing what it would be like to live in a Jane Austen novel. So there's a lot that's been unprecedented about the situation we find ourselves in 2020, not least the spike in the use of the word unprecedented. But there's also a lot about it that's an intensification of the familiar and the mundane. It's a strange in-between, limbo-like kind of apocalypse. So if we tend towards apocalyptic thinking, even when we're not in the middle of a global pandemic, if we are apocalyptics in general, then what does that mean for how we respond to the current crisis, how we should respond? There are a lot of dimensions to our apocalypticism, a lot of psychological and social depths to plumb there. Today, I just want to dip a toe in and talk about one positive to our pessimism and one negative. To put it another way, one of the pleasures of pessimism, why do we seem so keen to be pessimistic? And one of the perils or the pitfalls of pessimism, because alliteration, yay. Obviously, there is a lot that is not appealing about pessimism. Nobody wants to be an Eeyore. Nobody wants to be a Chicken Little. Nobody wants to be even a Cassandra. Cassandra, you may recall from your Greek mythology, was the Trojan princess who was given the gift of seeing the future, but also the curse that nobody would ever believe her prophecies. So Cassandra was right, but she was ignored or mocked for her negativity. Being a Cassandra is no fun either. But many of us do seem to enjoy our pessimism, at least a little bit. At the extreme end of this, we might put some members of the prepper or survivalist movement. Maybe you've seen an episode or 20 of Doomsday Preppers, which features families zealously preparing for the end of their world, whether that's by super tornado or nuclear meltdown. You don't have to watch much, probably about 10 minutes of an episode, to get that actually these guys are pumped for the apocalypse. They are keen. I have very little in common with preppers, including my lack of any skills that might prove useful in the event of civilizational collapse. But the apocalyptic impulse, the desire to see all the crusty layers of modern life stripped back, the email and the Google calendars, the insurance premiums, the home renos, to get to the heart of what's really real, of what humans are like, what I'm like when all the trappings are gone, that is not a totally outlandish impulse. Someone who's explored this phenomenon is Rebecca Solnit. She's the writer who helped give us the term mansplaining. In her 2009 book, A Paradise Built in Hell, The Extraordinary Communities That Arise in Disaster, She investigates people's experiences of living through terrible disasters, earthquakes, economic collapses, the London Blitz, Chernobyl, Hurricane Katrina, and so on. And what she finds really intriguing is the nostalgia, the retrospective joy that people seem to feel for what was surely the worst experiences of their lives. Here's where she thinks that strange reaction comes from. She says, the joy matters as a measure of otherwise neglected desires, desires for public life and civil society, for inclusion, purpose, and power. What happened in these extreme situations, for the most part, was that people pulled together in ways they tend not to in peacetime and plenty. They stepped up, they talked to their neighbours, they helped each other. They let go of petty resentments and anxieties and discovered that they were more resilient and more needed than they knew. Does that sound familiar at all? Solnit points out that the word emergency, which for us is a wholly negative term, is built on the verb to emerge. It is a separation from the familiar, the emergence of a new atmosphere. Similarly, our term catastrophe comes from the Greek kata, down, and strafen, or turning over. She says it means an upset of what is expected and was originally used to mean a plot twist. To emerge into the unexpected is not always terrible. The word apocalypse itself, which for us has come to mean any catastrophically destructive event, in its original usage refers to an unveiling or uncovering. It's a word that is used first of parts of Jewish scripture and then became the name of the final book of the Christian Bible, the Apocalypse, or more commonly now, Revelation. This writing does tell humans about the future, about the end of the world, but its purpose is first and foremost what it says on the tin, revelation. Reality is laid bare, justice is done. The apocalypse is to be welcomed. In 1994, an earthquake struck LA a little before dawn and cut power to most of the city. The Griffith Observatory received phone calls from locals asking about the strange sky. What they were seeing was the stars. Given that 80% of Europe and North America no longer experiences real darkness, and depending on where you're watching from, maybe you don't either, the Milky Way tends to be a bit of an abstract idea to many of us. Solnit notes that this has often happened when disaster strikes, and she proposes an analogy. She says, you can think of the current social order as something akin to this artificial light, another kind of power that fails in disaster. In its place appears a reversion to improvised, collaborative, cooperative, and local society. The constellations of solidarity, altruism, and improvisation are within most of us and reappear at these times. People know what to do in a disaster. The loss of power, the disaster in the modern sense, is an affliction, but the reappearance of these old heavens is its opposite. This is the paradise entered through hell. So there's this potential positive to our pessimism, that it may point to the ways that we aren't satisfied with the current state of things. It can tell us something about the kind of society we would like to be. There's a potential positive to crisis itself. It can bring us together, bring out things that are hidden when everything is more normal. But let me talk to you also about one of the perils of our pessimism, and especially at a time like this. Crisis can bring us together, yes, but it can also drive us further apart. It can exacerbate the tensions that are already there, widen the chasm between us. One of the big issues, the big topics of conversation of our time, is the problem of polarization or tribalism, the division of our public life into us and them, often along political lines. And here our pessimism, our apocalypsism, takes a worrying turn. When our pessimism is partisan, it's not just that everything is going to hell in a handbasket. Actually, they are driving it there. Whoever they are, part of the pleasure that we take in our pessimism is in our sense of outrage, our sense of self-righteousness. our conviction that a significant portion of our fellow citizens are dangerous lunatics or somewhere down that end of the political spectrum, and that everything would be fine if they just weren't here. Here's the quote that sparked off for me this whole topic of pessimism. It's from one of my absolutely favourite writers, the novelist and essayist Marilynne Robinson. She writes, "Cultural pessimism is always fashionable, and since we are human, there are always grounds for it. It has the negative consequence of depressing the level of aspiration, the sense of the possible. And from time to time, it has the extremely negative consequence of encouraging a kind of sombre panic, a collective dream state in which recourse to terrible remedies is inspired by delusions of mortal threat. If there is anything in the life of any cultural period that gives good grounds for alarm, it is the rise of cultural pessimism, whose major passion is bitter hostility toward many or most of the people within the very culture the pessimists always feel they are intent on rescuing." She goes on, "When panic on one side is creating alarm on the other, it is easy to forget that there are always as good grounds for optimism as for pessimism. Exactly the same grounds, in fact. That is because we are human. We still have every potential for good we have ever had, and the same presumptive claim to respect, our own respect and one another's. We are still creatures of singular interest and value, agile of soul as we have always been, and as we will continue to be, even despite our errors and depredations, for as long as we abide on this earth. To value one another is our greatest safety, and to indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. To value one another is our greatest safety. To indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error." Marilynne Robinson has a particular anthropology. As a Christian, she believes both that people are much, much worse than we think. The Bible maintains what I would call a healthy pessimism about the destructiveness and pettiness and cruelty and foolishness that humans are capable of, all humans. And she believes that nobody is beyond the pale, that every person is made in the image of God, and that there is always more hope than we are inclined to think, because God is more powerful and more gracious than we are inclined to think. There are always grounds for pessimism and for optimism, the same grounds that we are human. In a pluralist democracy like ours and during a crisis like this one of the things that we need is a healthy pessimism about humans, one that includes ourselves, that starts with me, not those who disagree with me recognizing that all too often I am, in fact, the jerk. And the counterpart to that kind pessimism, that humble pessimism, is an optimism that includes the person I disagree with, that imagines and hopes on their behalf, that chooses recognition over incomprehension. Our cultural pessimism itself is a greater threat than many of the crises it feeds on. Once we stop recognizing ourselves as bound together in a common future, we lose much of the power that we have to shape that future. To value one another is our greatest safety. To indulge in fear and contempt is our gravest error. There's so much more to say about all this, of course. Let me leave you with a quote. It's apocryphally from Franklin Roosevelt, but more likely from a presidential advisor called John Gardner. And it goes something like this. "We observe a world of great opportunities disguised as insoluble problems." We observe a world of great opportunities disguised as insoluble problems. Whether you are intermittently homeschooling, spending your life on Zoom, working in health or government, odds are that you're facing some problems right now that look pretty insoluble. And I don't want to go down the line of, hey, when the bubonic plague came to Cambridge in 1665, Isaac Newton worked from home and invented calculus. How are you seizing the day? You know, for me personally, seeing opportunities hiding behind problems seems much more like an act of faith than of hyper-productivity. I believe in a God who can bring good out of the most unpromising raw material. I believe in a universe that has hope built into its very fabric. Our fears or hopes for the future, in general as well as during a global crisis will be largely a function of what we already believe, what we believe about other people, about being human, and about the nature of the world that we live in. Apocalypses, even the mundane kind, reveal. Among other things, they reveal what really matters to us and what's really in our hearts, good and bad. So stay safe, friends, and may this particular moment of revelation lead us to a healthier pessimism and a more gracious optimism, to less tribalism and more solidarity. Thank you.